Well, I have a very sad and depressing story to go over today, but it must be discussed because, unfortunately, not only is it historically relevant, and I'm someone who loves history, it is relevant to the present, like, well, so much of history. Uh, the story, I guess, starts about over 30 years ago, 1989-ish. I first heard about this yesterday from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in an interview he did on the Tom Woods Show about his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And apparently there's a chapter in that book about this story, which I've been reading about it all morning, trying to digest as much of the establishment spin on it as I could to see, hey, what do they have as an explanation for this? First, though, I'll give you the version that I heard from Bobby Kennedy, which is basically that Tony Fauci, as we all know, or I guess not everybody, but before this, Tony Fauci was real famous for pushing AZT as an AIDS drug back in the 80s. A lot of gay people not fond of Tony Fauci. They felt like he suppressed other treatments that were more effective in favor of AZT for presumably financial reasons in order to help out big pharma. AZT has been criticized as being extremely toxic, so toxic in fact that it was originally developed as chemotherapy for cancer, which, as you know, chemotherapy is when people willingly ingest poison in the hopes that it kills the cancer faster than it kills the rest of their body. This was so toxic that it didn't even work in that application. And so they tried to repurpose it as an AIDS drug, and in a petri dish, apparently, it did kill AIDS. But as real people started to take it, yes, it would kill the AIDS, or it would kill the HIV virus. It would stop it from replicating, but it also would kill off, much of the rest of their bodies. And so, at best, it would seem to me, based on even the information that we have now, it seems unclear that AZT, even in adults who have asymptomatic AIDS, HIV, who just have HIV, who haven't developed AIDS symptoms yet, it would seem at best unclear whether or not this drug has a net positive effect, because you take people who are otherwise asymptomatic and you give them this drug, it makes them violently ill, makes them very weak, leads to liver problems and failure of other organs. Those are the official side effects. And the benefits of it are that it raises your T cell count because, AIDS is not able to, or the HIV virus is not able to replicate as quickly, because the cells are being killed by all of this poison. However, later trials seem to indicate that the disease still spreads it still progresses the same. It doesn't really seem to slow the progression, according to other trials. The earliest U.S. trials have been criticized as not being very well controlled. There was a later French trial, which included a lot more people, like 1,700 people, I guess in the 90s, which showed that there was no statistically significant difference, in deaths between the placebo group and the AZT group, even if and not just all-cause, not even looking at all-cause deaths. So ruling out deaths from side effects, just deaths from AIDS, people still died at the same rate. It was, in fact, in absolute numbers, there were less people in the placebo group who died. Additionally, though, this drug was very expensive. Cost something like $8,000 a month, I think. Of course, I don't know in what year's money that is. But anyway, it was very expensive. And this was the only drug that was offered up as any sort of treatment for HIV. But let's get to the real bad part. Let's get to the real scary part, because at least you can make the case, okay, sure, they were giving people poison and it didn't have any... It's unclear whether it had any real benefits at all. But those are consenting adults. They were desperate. They were willing to take whatever was offered to them. Okay. Well, you know who didn't consent and who wasn't in a position to just take whatever was offered to them, who didn't want that? Orphans and foster children in New York City. Those are the other people that they gave these drugs to. not just consenting adults, not just, gay guys in San Francisco who were scared to death, that, they watched all their friends dying all throughout the 80s, and then they hear about this drug, and they're HIV positive too, and they haven't started getting sick yet, and they say, okay, I'll take it. No. Kids who were largely born with HIV in New York City were being given not just AZT, but other highly toxic drugs in a cocktail against their will and without parental consent because they're in foster care. So the city just decided, hey, we're going to give these drugs to these kids, and they had no real parents, they had no advocate. It is not informed consent when the state is ward over orphans, and the state wants to do medical experiments, and they say, okay, well, let's just do it on these orphans. And since we're legally the orphan's guardian, that's informed consent. By that logic, Joseph Mengele's experiments were permissible because he was experimenting on children whose parents had already been sent to the gas chambers. Okay? So those children then became wards of the Third Reich because they were orphans then. Their parents were dead. And so Mengele could do whatever he wanted to them, and it was totally ethical because he had the, he was able to provide informed consent because he was informed about what he was doing, and he consented to doing it to these children, even though the children themselves obviously did not want to be experimented upon. Now, believe it or not, it actually gets worse. They were not just testing these drugs to see, hey, can we, these kids, these are desperate kids with HIV. Let's see if we can do whatever we can to try and keep them alive. So let's give them some of these drugs, see if anything works, and hopefully, we can extend their lives as long as possible because these were, kids born with HIV, and so they're not going to have a very long life expectancy. No, apparently this was not a trial to determine efficacy of these drugs in children. This was a trial to determine the tolerance for these drugs in children. So, i.e., the point of the experiment was to load these kids up, make them take as much poison as possible, and see how much their bodies could handle before they gave out. The purpose of the trial is to make them sick. It's to see how much of these drugs can they take before they can't take it anymore, and presumably they die. Now, of course, in theory, they're supposed to stop before then. They're not supposed to come right up to the point of death. But these kids, by all accounts, this is not, this part's not disputed. They were very, very sick. They were not doing well. They were having organ problems. They were, in extreme pain. Their muscles were wasting away. The children knew that the drugs were making them sick because kids who were otherwise healthy after being given them became extremely ill, and they saw what was happening to all the other kids, and they were resisting. And according to a witness, and I will link to the BBC documentary, and I'll try to link to as much as possible. There's so much stuff that I read about this morning from all different places, trying to get, the whistleblower side of the story, and then, sort of the establishment cover-up side of the story, which I'll get to that. It wasn't very convincing. But anyway, this kid who the BBC confirmed, and again, that's mainstream media, the BBC, although I'll get to this in the Snopes cover-up article later. They claim that the BBC, apologized for this because I guess they consulted some guy who has a weird theory about HIV, an idea which, in my watching the BBC documentary, didn't come up, had nothing to do with the experience of this kid or the other witnesses. The Snopes, I don't want to get into the Snopes article yet. So this kid who the BBC interviewed, he was 15. The BBC presenter said that he had the physique of a 10-year-old. So obviously he was very weak, stunted growth. That's what he appeared. He was a victim of these experiments. He didn't want to take them. But what he found out was if you don't take the medicine, they send you to I forget what the full name is, but it's a Presbyterian hospital in New York. I believe it's the big Columbia Presbyterian, something like that. It's the big hospital system there. And they would insert a feeding tube directly into your stomach, and they would administer the drugs that way. which is incredibly barbaric. So these children, not only were they not given informed consent, there was no consent at all. In fact, the children openly resisted, and the result was even more invasive surgical procedures to administer this poison. And nowhere did any of the debunkers try and debunk this 15-year-old kid. They didn't say, oh, he's a liar. They didn't say that the nurse was lying. They didn't say that the people who, well, actually, no. They did say that nobody's children were, that no children were taken, against their will from, from a household because the parents didn't consent to giving them the drugs. Although even that, their wording on that, I will dispute here in a minute. Now, of course, all of this was funded by Fauci's agency when he was the head of the agency. So the accusation, then, levied by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and many other people, is that, hey, this guy who's supposed to be our big, public health guru, conducted barbaric experiments on children, trying to see how much poison he could force them to ingest before, just to see how much their bodies could handle. That's what a tolerance experiment is. It was performed on foster children and orphans who, by definition, cannot give consent in any real sense, even if the state claims to be their guardian. Well, if the state wants to conduct these experiments, obviously the states can say, okay, yeah, we consent. That's not informed consent. These kids had nobody. They were extremely vulnerable. And according to the BBC, 98% of the kids in foster care and in these orphanages in New York are, it was just the foster care, they said, are black or Hispanic. And so another accusation that was levied was that, hey, these experiments were specifically, targeted at black and Hispanic kids. It's a fair point. But Snopes, of course, when you start a sentence that way, it's hard to take it seriously. But Snopes declares all this to be false. They said, fact check, false. And so I read their article. I said, okay, Snopes, you say this isn't true. I hope it's not true. I really was reading the Snopes article. I wanted them to give me some evidence to say, oh, no, this is nonsense. The children were not being given, dangerous drugs, against their will. There was no, violation of informed consent. No, I mean, even Snopes, flat out in their article says, okay, yeah, so informed consent was not given in all cases. But that's even assuming, because Snopes, sort of granted the city the idea that, okay, well, the city can give informed consent for the orphans, which, I mean, that in and of itself is insane. So it's a real stretch for Snopes. But even with giving them that, Snopes found that even in some cases, the city didn't even consent internally to some of these children being experimented on, who ultimately were victimized by these experiments. So like I said, as far as I'm concerned, almost none of these kids were legitimately able to participate in this trial. They did not have real parents. And even the board, the committee that was assembled to determine whether or not kids should participate in this experiment, some kids participated even in spite of not being approved by that committee. So the whole thing's a mess. It's totally sick. I saw no way, there was no way for them to defend it. They didn't, really. I mean, actually, I'll give it this way. It was, Snopes' defense of this was that, well, look, the death rate for AIDS was much higher in the 1980s than it is today. And these experiments were, part of, the research gave us valuable data that helped us get to this point to where AIDS is not as big of a threat now as it was in the 1980s. And so Snopes was making the case that it's false, that, that these allegations are false because, well, we got good data out of it. So Snopes' defense is that, well, the experiments were a success because now we know that, if we give the kids this much drugs, it's extremely toxic. So it was useful. The kids served some use. They didn't die in vain. That's Snopes' defense of experimenting on orphans. And so really, it's a remarkable article. I recommend everybody read the Snopes article. It really, it prevents you from being able to ignore the reality of what occurred. And it's a lot for me to ingest in less than 24 hours. I mean, it was yesterday afternoon that I, listened to that interview, and this morning that I really started trying to dig into it. Now, getting back to the Snopes defense, that, well, we got good data out of this, AIDS treatment's better now than it used to be, and so that's why doing medical trials is vital and very important. That was their point. Well, medical trials are important. It's like, okay, yeah, thank you, 5-year-old. That's, I mean, what a robotic response. It is not disputed that we gained a tremendous amount of medical knowledge from the Nazi experiments. For a long time, you had a lot of diseases that were named after Nazi doctors because they discovered them. They, found treatments, all these things, by experimenting on, Jews and the other people in the concentration camps. And unfortunately, a lot of those diseases have been renamed to get rid of the Nazi names. I think that is wrong because it's the medical establishment trying to cover up their own past, distance themselves from the Nazis while still using all of their research. Okay? So we got lots of good data from Nazi experiments, but the Nazi experiments, that did not justify them. They were still evil. People recognize it. They were evil. And so just because we might have gotten some good data out, according to Snopes, out of experimenting with poison in orphans, that doesn't make it okay. It's about as okay as what the Nazis did. So if you want to defend Fauci, go ahead and defend Mengele. I mean, how do you not make a direct comparison between the two? The only out, I guess, that Snopes has left is that they say, well, we didn't see any document that Fauci specifically signed that okayed this. It's like, he's the director of the agency. The agency funded this. There's not that many people in there. Fauci, I don't think anyone disputes that Fauci controls his agency. So really hard to take that. I don't think that any serious person would. It's absurd. It's childish, just like so much of this crap. You have no way of escaping blame for experiments that were funded by your agency. It's your whole job to spend taxpayer money. That's what Fauci does. He's a bureaucrat. So if he can't even be held responsible for his own, and this is something that's pretty important, I would think that it would make it to his desk. Experiments on children. Oh no, I was too busy experimenting on beagles. I didn't have time to read over the thing. I just let one of my underlings, sign off on the experimentation of children. Yeah, right. The guy's a monster. I mean, the Snopes' defense is, if that's the best that can be mustered by the establishment to try and cover up the blame for what happened to these kids, then there really is no defense. There's no plausible deniability. And if he did it to vulnerable orphans then, what do you think he'd be willing to do to us now, all of us? So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow. I might do a bit of a follow-up on this, just sort of when I digest the information a little more. It's a bit of a shock, but I'll try my best to link to as much as I can in the description so you can read up on things as well. But spread the word about this if you didn't know about it either, because people need to know that this happened.